Hello, everyone in the Boss Hole Transformation Nation. This is Sarah Best, your co-host. Really eager to bring forward today's episode, which is chock full of leadership and life inspiration and lessons. Have you ever heard the word waypoints? It's military jargon. It refers to guideposts on a map. And soldiers use these guideposts to direct themselves in and out of locations, find rendezvous points. Our story today features Colonel Greg Gadson, retired Colonel Greg Gadson, a battalion commander and former West Point football player who lost both legs as a result of an IED attack in Iraq in 2007. At this point, his waypoints were to change dramatically. And the book we feature today is Finding Waypoints, a warrior's journey towards peace and purpose. The book talks about how Colonel Gadson endured his long, painful recovery and emerged not only as a spiritual guide, but an actor, an assistant coach to the New York Giants. You may remember the 2008 Super Bowl win by the New York Giants. They credit Colonel Gadson for his spiritual leadership and coaching through that 2007 season that took them from last place to the championship in 2008. And shortly after that, Colonel Gadson appeared in the motion picture called Battleship and has spent his time ever since being a motivational speaker since he's retired from the Army and sharing his deeply personal story of transformation, which, by the way, is captured by a pretty accomplished and amazing writer named Terese Schlachter. Terese is an author, video producer, writing coach, instructor, and chief storyteller at Ridgeback Communications. She began her career in Northwest Ohio as a reporter and hopped around to many stations before finding her spot behind the camera as a producer. She is a 3-time Emmy Award-winning producer. She's worked for MSNBC, NBC News in Washington, where she covered politics and other natural disasters. And when she moved from Capitol Hill to the Pentagon, and she worked for the Pentagon Channel, this is where she spent many days at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. This is where she met Colonel Gadson. And the story of their friendship and her ability to capture these amazing things that have happened both for and to Colonel Gadson make for a really awesome interview and a powerful read in Finding Waypoints. For now, let's dig in.
The Boss Hole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, the talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode.
A very big welcome to our guests today, Terese Schlachter and Colonel Gregory Gadson. Thank you for joining us today on the Boss Hole Chronicles.
Thank you,
Hi,
Sarah.
Sarah and John.
So good to have you.
Yeah.
And it goes without saying that this is going to be a rich dialogue we're going to have here because maybe people aren't going to experience Colonel Gadson what you have, but there's so much we can take away from how you faced what came your way. So that's the focus of our discussion today on the Boss Hole Chronicles. But we couldn't start without saying, how did the two of you meet? And this, as I understand it, the story goes, Colonel Gadson, that you literally fell into Terese's life following this horrific IED incident that you endured in Afghanistan. Let's start there if we could.
Yeah, that is well said. Probably the best that I've ever heard, Sarah, but I'll let Terese start out because she really remembers it the best.
So I was working as a producer for what was then known as the Pentagon Channel, and I was covering Walter Reed Army Medical Center. That's what it was called at the time. And they were opening a new rehab wing of the hospital. And so I was there covering the opening of that wing. And they had soldiers, not just soldiers, Marine and Navy, posted all over the place demonstrating the new equipment. So I was standing next to this track and Greg was demonstrating, and he was also learning to use his new prosthetic legs. And so he came down the track toward me and he was on a pulley system. And the pulley was attached to the ceiling and then attached like by a carabiner to a harness on his back. So that, if he fell, he wouldn't face plant. So as he was coming by me, he did lose his balance and he wiped out, but he didn't go down. He just was kind of hanging there like Pinocchio off of this cable.
Wow.
I was with a photographer, of course. So, click, click, the camera started and Greg looks up out of the corner of his eye and he's like, "Are you going to use that?" I said, "Well, yeah." And he goes, and he gets himself back together. He goes, "Well, I guess I better do it again." And he went around the track and came by again. And I said, "Isn't that the whole point where people see you fall, but then they see you get back up and continue?"
And that's so powerful. So powerful. And it's the beginning of the whole story. You formed a friendship and a bond. You tracked along with Greg as you endured. I can't even imagine the kind of pain and challenge you encountered in your long recovery. But together, you kind of walked this journey, and there was a story to be told. And I know, Colonel Gadson, you were not big on sharing the story initially because you're a humble guy. And I'm sure it was emotionally challenging. In fact, when I was doing my research, I saw that it was about 13 years before you actually gave a thumbs up. And that was with the encouragement of a good friend to say, "Hey, let's share this story." But how did you come to the place where it became important to share the story for you?
Thanks, Sarah. First, you're right. It was tough. And, in hindsight, I have to share that I hope that I would have, but I'm not sure I would have if I knew I was going to be sharing it, if I would have been so open. The fact is that I never imagined sharing it. And so I gave Terese everything. I mean, I didn't have a filter. At least I didn't have a filter that I was evaluating or sharing things from or through. So with that said, my best friend Chuck Schretzman, who was an outside linebacker with me. I mean, we went to prep school together before we went to West Point, and really have had parallel lives in many different ways. We retired a month apart after 26 years of service, and 6 months after he retired, he was diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. His words really alone were, Greg, this is something that you need to share. You should share, and that was, what got me to unhook my anchor and move forward. One of the things that I shared with Terese, even after the fact, it was still very tough, even after I agreed to do it. There was a lot of, I wasn't comfortable. I wasn't comfortable with, I suppose, that sort of access to me, or that in that form, in that way that, someone could just pick up a book and read about me. And that even took a while to get used to, even after it was out.
I can only imagine. To me, that's our first leadership lesson today, is the power of vulnerability. Your willingness to be vulnerable and completely honest and candid and open in the telling of the story, and what that makes available to other people. We could spend days talking about the impact of this amazing story written in the book, Finding Waypoints. Terese, you want to add anything to that?
Greg and I worked, and you're right, it was about 13 years. All the time and all the conversations we had, I just assumed he knew it was going to be a book that I wanted to publish.
Assumed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when we got right down to actually publishing it, yeah, it was a little bit of we had some head bumping. Yeah, and then I got a publisher. And so that was, a cause for me to celebrate and a cause for Greg to get very nervous.
Absolutely.
And I remember when they picked the cover even, which, we've come, I think it's a beautiful cover. He had given me that photo. That's a self-portrait. And he had given it to me a long time ago. And I had just sent a whole bunch of different photos that I thought might work for the cover to the publisher. And I was really surprised when he picked that one and he showed me, what the cover would look like. And it's a picture of Greg without a shirt on. And he is very exposed and very, he says, "It looks like I'm in my underwear on the cover of the book." He said, "I'm just so..."
It looks like, she said, it actually looks like I'm nude, but
You kind of do.
I'm looking at the cover right now. I think I understand what it represents, and it is striking. It's powerful. It's almost breathtaking when you really look at it, but it fits. And maybe then this is the segue to our next question is the Finding Waypoints. So the title of the book is Finding Waypoints, A Warrior's Journey Toward Peace and Purpose. But the Finding Waypoints, the waypoints, a very commonly known military term. Some people may not know what that means. Colonel Gadson, would you share with us, your take on that and how in the book we understand what happens to the waypoints?
Right. We had some discussions even about the title, and I honestly don't remember what made me think of the term waypoints, but it obviously has a professional connection. And first, it's really about that we never go anywhere straight in life, or rarely do we go in a straight line. We have intersections of whether we have to get gas or we have to get food or whether we have to stop for the night. Those are waypoints. And for me, it really is about understanding that our lives are really not about a final destination, but it's really about the journey and
Mm.
being present in that journey and living that journey and connecting. And so, whether it's with your family, whether it's at work and leadership, are you able to be where you're at? Are you able to connect? Are you able to be authentic? You mentioned vulnerability. Are you able to expose yourself? And I say be authentic. It's a military term, but aviators and seafarers use it as well. And I think to me, it's really about sort of the process of really kind of understanding and how you live your life.
That's leadership lesson number 2, that the waypoints are the guide to be here and now, and to remind us not to just focus or only focus on the destination, but to be here, to be present. That's powerful.
For those that are not familiar with the story or the book, you were actually on your way back from a memorial service. Is that not correct?
Yes, sir. I was. First Lieutenant Ryan Jones and Specialist Armando Sunson. They had been killed on the 2nd of May. They were in a sister battalion from my brigade from Fort Riley. And as I mentioned their names, I mean that I still get chills down my spine because I remember I was really struggling. Like, are we making progress? It shook me from the standpoint of, were we making a difference? Is all this sacrifice that's happening over here, are we moving the ball? At the time, we were one of the forces that the president directed there as the operation commonly known as the Surge. And it really felt like every single day there was a U.S. service member getting killed, and you couldn't see an end. You could not see the destination, and you just had to stay focused. I remember I was in an emotional place where I was heading back to my headquarters, but I was still thinking about these young men and their families
Right.
and what they were going through. And then wham, that's when I'm freaking hit. And so it just...
That is the part that seems so... I mean, you are trained and are men and women in uniform. I mean, you are trained and you were in country. I mean, you were in an active military zone and you are trained to be alert, ready. And this was a moment, and that's what I was wondering about. You were probably reflecting, feeling, thinking about your fellow soldiers. And then it happens. And not that you let your guard down, but it's like, I'm just trying to get a moment to reflect on my friends and fellow servicemen, and this happens.
Absolutely. There was this tremendous anger and just like, good God, this is never stopping. And I knew what it was. And it didn't take me long to figure out that I was hurt and this was not very good.
I mean, thank you for again, I wanted to think about that moment because that is a waypoint, as you're saying. What it makes me think of, Colonel, is sometimes God gives us the answer before we know the question. This has happened, and now I have to figure out what is the purpose, what is the meaning, and what is the direction. And really, that's your message: is you did not let it stop you there.
I will say this: as I was kind of laying there, and I could not move, I could not get up. I didn't physically know what was wrong with me. I say my last thought, my last prayer, it wasn't even about my family. It was, I simply said, God, I do not want to die in this country. For me as a Christian, people ask me all the time about how strong was your faith? And I'm like, I don't know. How do you measure your faith? But I can say in that moment that I called on my God to save me. And I can't imagine not knowing and not having a faith strong enough to make that call, to make that prayer. So, what a way to find out where your faith is. But I'm glad mine was there.
And he answered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Colonel Gadson, I have to ask, it was written about you, back in November. Someone was describing you, and they said, a man of deep faith, complete acceptance, and total gratitude. So if we fast forward to where you are today,
Right.
not even beginning to understand the grueling nature of your emotional recovery from what you endured, does the faith correspond with and have anything to do with what is described as complete acceptance and total gratitude?
Absolutely, Sarah. And the book does a great job of documenting like what I physically went through. And many people will say to me, that's a miracle. And it is. It's a miracle, 129 pints of blood going into arrests 6 different times that evening. It was a miracle that the doctors operating on me were West Point grads that recognized me. I mean, I'm convinced that's why they gave me so much blood. But to me, my greatest miracle was really, getting out of the ICU and being on Ward 57. My legs are gone. I don't know which way is up. You can imagine every emotion under the sun is going back and forth through me. But the one that was totally absent was anger. I literally had no anger. And so to be quickly, I say, God not only saved me, but he healed me. I still had a long way to go, but I had accepted. There was no anger. I had truly accepted what had happened to me. And I think in so many ways, ready to move forward. We say this as cliches. God said that we can handle anything, but that's through his word. That's through our belief, that's through our faith. And I had to take that walk. I had to walk by faith, not by sight. I had no idea what to expect, what was coming, but I trusted that I was going to get through because that's what he's promised us. And I had to do that.
So that makes me think about what I'll call, are we on leadership lesson 4 now? Have there been 3 already? We're on 4.
I think these are life lessons more than leadership lessons, but thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely. They
Yeah.
are life lessons. It was when you were co-coaching and being a spiritual guide to the Giants in 2007, leading into 2008, where you taught them to believe that believing is better than knowing. Believing it's going to be okay and it can happen is better than knowing. So I see that connection there. Has that always been a part of you, or?
I think so. I go back to growing up, and my dad he taught me my parents taught me, but my dad would, whenever I had any doubts, he would engage me on a faith level to get through. And I appreciate the question because, a lot of what is this runway for me and this journey for me has been about, starts with my parents born in the mid 40s in the Jim Crow South, who lived a life that only I could imagine, laid the groundwork for understanding that I could persevere and overcome through any set of circumstances. And not only that, but learning not to carry hate, but to be above it, to rise above it was the greatest gift and example that they gave me. And, the irony of this little ironies that, my parents our first home was literally an apartment adjacent to Walter Reed. My parents were college students at Howard University, who was, oh, by the way, founded by a West Point grad who lost his arm in the Civil War. I mean, and then I would go into West Point. I mean, just the amazing connectivity to our lives is amazing.
Yeah, and as I stand back, and I can share this with our listeners, Terese Schlachter is my beloved cousin, and I know, and I have known for a long time, what a gifted writer, producer, and now writing coach, has a great media company. I've known of her gift for a long time, but now I can kind of in my mind see how these trajectories, your life paths, hers and yours, came
Yep.
together in such a powerful, on purpose, not a coincidence kind of way. Terese, maybe let's talk about you for a minute. 3-time Emmy Award winner, an amazing person. What's so great about your influence in the book is that there's a piece of you in this story too. You weave so beautifully. You weave your experience of Greg and this story right into it, and we learn so much, not just about Greg's journey and his turmoil and his triumph, but about you as well.
I guess the thing that Greg gave me immediately, even though he didn't know, was that I always wanted to be a writer and I always wanted to write a book. And I was a television news producer and I was in that role for so many years. And, I had to pay the bills. And so I kept doing that. And I always wanted to break away and write something, but nothing came along. And then, Greg goes and helps the Giants win the Super Bowl. So I'm like, oh, that seems like a pretty good story. So I thought maybe, I'd write that down. And so, and worked with him, over many years to do that. So that is, that was kind of one of my waypoints, I guess, that changed my trajectory. I really haven't done a video in probably a year. I've focused more on my writing and I continue to do that.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit about the Wounded Warrior Project and how you came to be at Walter Reed as it was that day? I mean, you had been involved in that and in chronicling journeys. You'd been doing that for quite a while.
Yeah, well, the Wounded Warrior Project wasn't really part of it. I worked for the Pentagon Channel, and we did encounter Wounded Warrior Project on a number of my stories, and it's a great organization. How I came to be at the Pentagon Channel. So I worked for NBC and MSNBC, and I needed just to leave there for a number of reasons. There wasn't anywhere else for me to move ahead there. So I wound up at the Pentagon, and honestly, I was kind of kicking and screaming. I was like, I don't want to go work at the Pentagon. Why would I want to go work for the Pentagon? And it was one of those things where, I wound up there for 8 years and met Greg and was able to write this book. So, yeah.
Sarah, one of the things that I'd like to add is, so we worked on this book and we got it to we were done. And most of the time in the book process, I guess you get hired, you find a publisher, and then you kind of write it. Well, we kind of, put the cart before the horse. And so we had a complete book, and then we're trying to find somebody to publish it. And Terese did all of that legwork. I had no way of really helping her. I didn't. Over a couple of years, Terese got really frustrated. And she's like, I just want to just publish this thing. It's just, and I guess maybe in a little bit of way, I surprised myself because I was like, no. This is it was a good book. I hadn't even read it for up to 13 years. It wasn't until COVID, when we were all locked down and not going anywhere, that Terese literally had to read the book to me because it was just so emotional for me. And I'm like, we're gonna find a publisher. We're not gonna just. I go, say anybody can publish a book now. So no, we're not. I was pretty insistent that wasn't what we were going to do, just to say to check the block. So
we had talked about self-publishing, and I felt like I had tried everything. I had gone, queried every agent and university presses and small presses, and just wasn't getting anywhere. And it wound up that I was at AWP, with the Association of Writing Programs. It's the biggest writing conference in the country. And I had met a couple of years ago a guy named Ron Capps, who runs the Veterans Writing Program, and he was running it out of Walter Reed a while ago. But he had a book out, and he said, I think, and he knew of Greg, and he said, I think my publisher might be interested in it. And that's how we found Tim Schaffner. And that was such a stroke of good luck. And, I'll always be grateful to Ron, of course, to Tim too, for taking us on.
Clearly meant to be. And another life lesson / leadership lesson is, don't give up. Don't give up. And how things are so interconnected, as you indicated, Colonel Gadson. The stories, they weave so in and out. Our lives do like that. So meeting a person and making that connection, would we say yes to it? Would we stay open to it? I think that's one of the things I loved in the story, in the book. It's advice that you give, Colonel Greg, that says, don't say yes to opportunities. You don't know. If you say no, you don't know what you're not going to have access to. And I think about, okay, so you recover only months after the explosion and the loss of your legs. There you are in the locker room with the New York Giants, and they're dependent on you, and they credit you for their 2008 win in the Super Bowl. And then there was a movie. You got a tap on the shoulder to be an actor in a movie. Tell us a little bit about that.
I renewed this sort of attitude that, what do you got to lose? What do you got to lose by not trying? And Peter Berg, born and raised in New York, a lifelong New York Giants fan, was aware of my relationship with the Giants. And, he wanted me in the movie. And, so he called me up and told me he wanted me to be in the movie. And I was like, okay, what do I got to lose? I tell everyone I never acted. I never played a tree in a school play, much less acted. But, my recovery really gave me courage to try anything. You know what? I had to learn how to fail again. I had to learn how to fail.
Yeah.
And that was falling, walking, getting up and knowing that you're going to fall. When you're wearing prosthetics, when something like this happens, falling is a part of life.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is when we grow up and we become adults, we forget how to fall. We become afraid to fail. I was determined not to let that happen in my life.
Well, that reminds me, there's a story in one of the latter chapters of the book where you take a spill on the sidewalk and you're looking around. It's so well described. I felt like I was right there next to you reading it. And the only people available to help you were these two women who, as it's described in the book,
old ladies, two
little old ladies out for like a ladies' afternoon that, carrying a purse and
in Old Town, right? You're talking about the one in Old Town?
Yeah, on the cobblestones. Yeah.
Yep.
On the brick, I think it was a brick sidewalk.
And they got you up. They did it. They helped you and you let them. And you were graceful about it. And learning to fail. For some people, it's not again. It's for the first time, like learning that it's okay and it's actually important to fail. How powerful that is. And you mentioned courage. I don't think that's a word we say enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, really, the other part of that is really the humility to accept help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That, I think, in terms of my leadership, the humility of accepting help was tremendously powerful for me. So, and transforming for me. So, one day I was this guy that needed help with very little in life, if anything. And now I literally depend on it.
Yeah. Well, you were the helper. You were the person providing protection and security and defense. And that totally shifts. I got to go back to the football really quick. I'm sorry. So these were during the Eli days, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Because I remember this very well because I know there were a lot of people that were thinking Eli was going to be a bust and man, I tell you what, wow, that all turned around. And I never knew this story or your role in it. So when I started to read about that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Like when you talk about those different connections. But if I may ask, Colonel Gadson, our listeners, when you think about the Boss Hole Chronicles, and it seems rather flippant considering the magnitude of your story, but people that are in leadership roles, I think they're hungry for something relevant because I think there's a lot of noise out there. I think there's a lot of stuff published and there's so many podcasts other than ours. Ours is great. People should listen to it, but a lot of other noise out there to try to help people understand this is the way to be a great leader. What would you say to them? Those people are out there that are in a leadership role that are struggling to figure out how do I do this well? I know you've already given us some tidbits. I think the humility is huge. What would you say to them?
I think over the years, I've consistently sort of come to these 3 points. We've touched on humility. We've touched on vulnerability. I mean, that's sort of who you are. But in terms of execution, what I've found is these 3 words: trust, empowerment, empowering, and holding accountable. And we can think of the word trust from the perspective of the obvious, it's beyond trustworthy. I trust you, you trust me. But really, it's about creating an environment where we can communicate I've communicated effectively, but we have a relationship. We have a dialogue where you can come to me with bad news. You can come to me and say, "Hey, boss, I think that's a stupid idea," or can we consider doing it this way?
Mhm.
Do you have that kind of trust environment? And then next, I talk about empowerment. The worst thing we can do as bosses is tell our subordinates, well, they come up with a solution or they've executed and you say, well, I would have done it that way,
Right.
or I would do it this way. I've just now empowered. Now I've got the organization thinking about how to please me. I got the organization thinking about them trying to solve something the way they would, that I would do it versus trusting them to do it. So you got to
Mhm.
empower and truly empower people. And then finally, I say holding accountable. That's you and I, that's our team kind. Okay, what did we say we were going to do? What do we do? What did we learn from it? Look, we got to learn. We don't get to make the same mistakes twice.
Right.
Did everything go
That's true.
perfect? No, but let's make sure that we learn. And I'm not very sympathetic about making the same mistake twice. But again, that's the system. Accountability goes both ways. I'm
Mhm.
accountable to you just as much as you're accountable to me. My
Mhm.
accountability is about setting the conditions or helping set the conditions so you can succeed and accomplish what it is that we expect.
And
That's
to
awesome.
be able to do that, you have to be present. It
Yep.
kind of brings us
Yep.
back full circle. I have one more question for you, Colonel Gadson. About a year after the incident, you came back to your battalion and you addressed them. And it's described in the book. It kind of even brings tears to my eyes. But what was that like for you to stand in front of them, knowing all that had gone on and they continued on? They clearly were impacted by the loss of your leadership and your the camaraderie that you brought to the battalion. But there you
Yeah.
were, and it was a beautiful moment, and I think you handled it really beautifully. Tell us about that.
Well, Sarah, I mean, as you bring it up, it's one of the things that if you could see me, like I immediately start tearing up when I think about that moment. It is, almost 18 years later. It's a very emotional point for me, and the one thing that probably is behind a lot of the emotion is, you do your job, and I love these soldiers, I love these guys, but I didn't know how much they loved me. And that's overwhelming, the knowing and learning how they felt about me. The other part is that every single one of my soldiers that deployed came back. We were the only battalion out of 6 battalions that was fortunate to have that happen. We had our brigade, the brigade from Fort Riley that I was part of, 120 soldiers didn't come home.
Mm.
So it's significant that we brought everybody back alive. And
That's remarkable. Yeah.
I think, too, one thing that happened when they lost Greg as their commander was that they certainly felt the loss, but I think they were also empowered because they wanted to do good by him.
Mm-hmm.
I think they worked harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, they would capture the number 3 Al Qaeda target in Baghdad during that deployment. So,
Your guys?
Wow.
yep.
Wow.
Well, and
Unbelievable.
Teresa, it goes without saying that, especially in the early chapters of the book, you do such a wonderful job of helping us understand the depth and breadth of emotion and brotherhood and sisterhood that lived in that group. It's powerful. It's a must read. It's a must read. Okay, Terese, last question for you. What is your favorite thing, either about the book or about having been able to complete this work with Colonel
Ah,
Gadson?
so my goal when we started, I say I wanted to write a book, but I wanted this story in the hands of people who could use it.
Yeah.
And when we started, remember, this was just after the surge. There were so many wounded.
Mhm.
Walter Reed was overwhelmed. There was just, there was such a struggle. And I just wanted this story to be in the hands of those other soldiers so that they could read it and understand that their life wasn't over, that they could recover physically and mentally and emotionally. It took me a lot longer to finish, took us a lot longer to finish, but I still am most gratified not by the numbers of sales, but by the feedback. When I get a feedback from someone who says, this really touched me, this changed my life, I'm so, it makes me emotional. I'm so happy that I got to read the story, and it's helping me with my struggles.
Wow.
Yeah, we are constantly getting notes. I have a friend who's writing a book now, and I think us doing the book has helped give her courage to do that. But even her authors, I shared some of his thoughts and comments, and you never get used to it. You never. It's almost a little overwhelming that you have someone say this helped change my life. I ran into a lady that I spoke to back at this summer, and I ran to an airport in Jacksonville, and she said, after you spoke to us, I read your book, and it allowed me to make the actions that I made. And I had the courage now. I found the courage to make a change. And it's just
Yeah. And there are those answers when you ask that question, do I want to tell the story, or who would want to hear the story? And you are getting that several fold over.
Well, and what comes to mind for me? Legacy. What an amazing legacy both of you have created. Thank you for your work. Thank you for Colonel Gadson for your willingness to put it out there. Terese, for the incredible gift you have and had in putting the story together. It's really powerful. We will, of course, put a link to purchase the book in our show notes. We'll have contact information for the both of you. That's okay. We'd like people, if they want to reach out to you, you're available to come and speak and share firsthand. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, John. It was this was fun. This was you guys are doing an amazing job, and this is just so authentic and fun to be here. It just flies by.
Well, thank you. The honor has truly been ours. Thank you.
So nice talking with you both, and so proud of you, Sarah.
She's awesome. All right, everybody. Well, thank you both, and everybody out there in the Boss Hole Transformation Nation. We will see you next time. Thanks very much for checking out this episode of the Boss Hole Chronicles. It was so good to have you here. And if you have your own Boss Hole story that you want to share with the Boss Hole Transformation Nation, just reach out. You can email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. We'll see you next time.